While MTG was claiming that NGOs were exploiting the American people, she had no idea that she couldn't explain which NGO had paid her how much money. But Jasmine Crockett knew everything, and she had the receipts. The House Committee on Oversight and Reform had seen its share of heated exchanges, but nothing quite prepared the gallery for what was about to unfold on this crisp Tuesday morning in Washington. The hearing was supposed to be routine, examining federal funding allocations to nonprofit organizations, the kind of dry policy discussion that usually emptied the press gallery by noon. But Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had spent the weekend in her Dallas office, not with family or campaign donors, but hunched over financial disclosure forms, IRS filings, and banking records that told a very different story than the one about to be presented to the American people. She sat quietly in her assigned seat, a thin black folder resting beside her nameplate. Inside were documents that would transform this routine hearing into a moment that political historians would study for decades. But for now, she waited, watching as Marjorie Taylor Greene adjusted her microphone and prepared to deliver what her staff had promised would be a devastating exposé of liberal NGO corruption. MTG's opening statement began exactly as expected. Bold declarations about taxpayer money being laundered through nonprofit organizations, passionate claims about Democrats using NGOs as slush funds for their political allies. Her voice carried that familiar mix of outrage and certainty that had made her a conservative media darling. The American people are being robbed, MTG declared, her Georgia accent sharpening with indignation. These so-called nonprofits are nothing more than pay-to-play schemes designed to enrich Democratic politicians and their cronies. They rake in billions of federal tax dollars while serving the Democrat Party instead of the American people. The familiar rhetoric rolled on, each accusation more inflammatory than the last. Heritage Foundation was clean, she insisted. Conservative nonprofits operated with transparency and integrity. It was the liberal organizations, the climate activists, the voter registration groups, the civil rights advocates, who were the real criminals in this story. But as MTG spoke, something was happening that the cameras couldn't capture. Jasmine Crockett was taking notes, not of what her colleague was saying, but cross-referencing it with the documents in her folder. Each claim MTG made was being fact-checked in real time against financial records that painted a very different picture. The irony was almost too perfect. Here was a congresswoman who had built her brand on exposing corruption, delivering a speech about NGO accountability while sitting just feet away from someone who had spent months investigating her own financial ties to the very organizations she now claimed to oppose. MTG's voice grew more passionate as she reached her crescendo. These corrupt NGOs do not serve the American people. They serve big government and the Democrat Party. If Americans support these causes, they can donate their own money. They shouldn't be forced to subsidize liberal activism through their tax dollars. The applause from the Republican side of the room was immediate and enthusiastic. MTG had delivered exactly what her base wanted to hear, a clear narrative with obvious villains and righteous heroes. The Heritage Foundation and other conservative think tanks were the good guys, fighting for transparency and fiscal responsibility. The liberal NGOs were the corrupt establishment, stealing taxpayer money to advance their radical agenda. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't applauding. She was reaching for her folder. What happened next would later be described by political analysts as a masterclass in preparation meeting opportunity. While MTG had spent weeks crafting talking points and rehearsing sound bites, Jasmine had spent months following a paper trail that led to some very uncomfortable questions about who was really benefiting from NGO funding. The chairman, a Republican from Ohio, was preparing to move to the next witness when Jasmine raised her hand. "Mr. Chairman, I have a point of inquiry regarding the gentlewoman's testimony." The room fell silent. Points of inquiry during opening statements were unusual, but not unprecedented. What was unusual was the calm, almost casual tone in Jasmine's voice. No anger, no outrage, just a simple request for clarification. The chair recognizes Congresswoman Crockett. Jasmine stood slowly, the black folder now open in her hands. She didn't look at MTG, didn't acknowledge the sudden tension that had filled the room. Instead, she spoke directly to the chairman, her voice clear and measured. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate my colleagues' passionate defense of fiscal responsibility and NGO transparency. These are important principles that I believe we all share, regardless of party affiliation." The politeness was almost disarming. No partisan attacks, no inflammatory rhetoric, just a gentle agreement with the principles MTG had outlined. "However," Jasmine continued, her tone remaining conversational, "I believe the American people deserve complete transparency about NGO funding, including funding that flows to organizations that support conservative causes." She paused, letting that phrase hang in the air. The implication was clear but not yet accusatory. She was simply extending MTG's own logic to include conservative organizations. With that in mind, I'd like to ask my colleague a few questions about her own statements regarding NGO funding and transparency. MTG shifted in her seat, clearly not expecting this turn. Her prepared remarks had focused entirely on liberal organizations. She had no talking points ready for questions about conservative NGOs, because in her narrative, they weren't part of the problem. "I'm happy to answer any questions," MTG replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. That's when Jasmine opened her folder and pulled out the first document. A single sheet of paper, but one that would change everything that followed. "I have here a financial disclosure form filed with the Federal Election Commission," Jasmine said, holding the document so the cameras could see it clearly. It shows a series of speaking fees and consulting payments made to various members of Congress by organizations that receive federal funding. The room was now completely silent. Even the usual background murmur of staff members and journalists had stopped. "These payments," Jasmine continued, "total several $100,000 over the past 3 years, all perfectly legal, all properly disclosed, but all coming from organizations that receive significant federal funding through various grant programs." She looked up from the document, making eye contact with MTG for the first time. "My question is simple. If we're going to discuss the integrity of NGO funding, shouldn't we also discuss these payments?" The silence that followed Jasmine's question was the kind that political veterans recognize immediately, the moment when a routine hearing transforms into something that will be replayed on cable news for weeks. MTG's face had gone from confident to confused to something approaching panic in the span of 30 seconds. "I'm not sure what you're implying," MTG finally responded, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. The passionate conviction that had driven her opening statement was nowhere to be found. Jasmine smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had hoped for exactly this response. "I'm not implying anything," she said, her tone remaining perfectly professional. "I'm simply reading from public financial disclosure documents. All of this information is available to anyone who takes the time to look." She held up another document, this one with highlighted sections that were clearly visible to the cameras. "According to FEC filings, the Freedom Research Institute paid you $47,000 in speaking fees over the past 18 months. The Constitutional Liberty Foundation provided $23,000 in consulting fees. The American Heritage Alliance contributed $31,000 for what's listed as its strategic advisory services." Each number landed like a physical blow. MTG's staff members were frantically typing on their phones, clearly trying to verify information they should have had at their fingertips. "Now, the interesting thing about these organizations," Jasmine continued, turning to a new page in her folder, is that they all receive substantial federal funding through various programs. The Freedom Research Institute, for example, received $2.3 million in federal grants last year alone. The mathematics were becoming uncomfortably clear to everyone in the room. MTG had just delivered a passionate speech about the corruption of taking money from federally funded organizations, while having taken over $100,000 from exactly those kinds of organizations. But wait, MTG interjected, her voice rising slightly. Those are legitimate think tanks that do important research. They're not like these liberal activist groups that just push partisan politics. It was exactly the response Jasmine had hoped for. That's an interesting distinction, she said, pulling out yet another document. Because according to IRS filings, the American Heritage Alliance spent 73% of its budget last year on what they classify as political education activities. The Constitutional Liberty Foundation devoted 68% of their resources to voter outreach programs. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. For comparison, the Sierra Club, which you mentioned specifically in your opening statement as an example of partisan activism, spent 52% of their budget on direct environmental conservation work and only 31% on what they classify as political activities. The trap had been perfectly constructed. MTG had created a standard for what constituted inappropriate NGO behavior, and now Jasmine was simply applying that same standard to the organizations that had been paying MTG herself. I'm not suggesting there's anything illegal about these arrangements, Jasmine continued, her tone remaining scrupulously fair. As I said, everything was properly disclosed. But I am suggesting that if we're going to have a serious conversation about NGO funding and political influence, we need to be consistent in how we apply our standards. The chairman, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the hearing had taken, attempted to regain control. Congresswoman Crockett, I appreciate your commitment to transparency, but I'm not sure this line of questioning is relevant to today's hearing focus. Jasmine turned to face the chairman directly, and for the first time, there was steel in her voice. With respect, Mr. Chairman, my colleague just spent 15 minutes arguing that any member of Congress who benefits from NGO funding while advocating for those organizations represents a fundamental corruption of our democratic system. I'm simply asking whether that standard applies equally to all members of Congress. The logic was unassailable. MTG had defined the terms of the debate, and now Jasmine was holding her to those exact terms. But the real bombshell was yet to come. However, Jasmine said, returning to her folder, there is one aspect of these financial relationships that I find particularly concerning. She pulled out a thick stack of papers bound with a black binder clip. These are internal communications from the American Heritage Alliance, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed 6 months ago. They detail the process by which speaking fees and consulting contracts were awarded to various political figures. MTG's face had gone completely pale. Her staff members had stopped typing and were now staring at Jasmine with undisguised alarm. According to these internal emails, the decision to offer my colleague a consulting contract was made just 3 days after she submitted a bill that would have increased federal funding for conservative think tanks by $200 million annually. The room erupted. Republican members immediately began shouting objections, demanding to know where these documents had come from and whether they had been properly authenticated. Democratic members were calling for order while trying to hide their own shock at the revelation. But Jasmine simply stood calmly in the center of the storm, holding the stack of papers that had just changed everything. Furthermore, she continued, raising her voice slightly to be heard over the commotion, these same internal communications show a pattern of coordinated messaging between multiple conservative organizations and congressional offices, including detailed scripts for speeches and talking points for media appearances. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about speaking fees or consulting contracts. It was about a systematic coordination between supposedly independent think tanks and the politicians who were supposed to be overseeing their federal funding. MTG finally found her voice again, but it came out as more of a shout than a reasoned response. This is a partisan witch hunt. These documents could be fabricated. This is exactly the kind of dirty politics that the American people are sick of. But even as she spoke, the damage was becoming visible. The conservative media figures who had been live tweeting praise for her opening statement had gone quiet. Republican staffers were making urgent phone calls. The entire narrative of the hearing had been completely reversed. Jasmine waited for the shouting to die down before responding, and when she did, her voice was quieter than before, which somehow made it carry more weight. "I understand my colleague's frustration," she said. "No one likes to have their integrity questioned, but these documents are part of the official congressional record, obtained through proper legal channels and verified by 3 independent sources." She held up a single sheet of paper from the stack. "This particular email, dated March 15th of last year, comes directly from the executive director of the Constitutional Liberty Foundation. It reads, and I quote, 'The Congresswoman's cooperation on the funding bill exceeded our expectations. Recommend approval for the full consulting package as discussed.'" The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet moments. This wasn't anticipation or surprise. It was the sound of a political career potentially ending in real time. The aftermath of Jasmine's revelation created the kind of chaos that C-SPAN cameras rarely capture in full. While the official record would show a brief recess called by the chairman, the reality was far more dramatic. Republican members huddled in urgent conferences with their staff. Democratic members tried to process what they had just witnessed. And in the center of it all, MTG sat frozen at her microphone, staring at the stack of documents that had just dismantled her carefully constructed narrative. But Jasmine wasn't finished. When the hearing resumed 15 minutes later, the energy in the room had completely shifted. What had begun as MTG's moment to shine had become her potential political funeral, and everyone present could feel the change. "Mr. Chairman," Jasmine said as soon as the gavel came down, "I have additional information that may be relevant to our discussion of NGO transparency and accountability." The chairman, clearly wishing he could adjourn the entire hearing, had no choice but to recognize her. The whole proceeding was being broadcast live, and any attempt to shut down legitimate questioning would itself become a scandal. The chair recognizes Congresswoman Crockett. Jasmine stood again, this time with a different folder, this one red instead of black. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to be very clear about something before I continue. I am not questioning anyone's right to earn speaking fees or accept consulting contracts. These are legitimate forms of income, and the disclosure requirements exist precisely so the public can make informed judgments about potential conflicts of interest." The measured tone was perfectly calculated. By acknowledging the legitimacy of the payments themselves, she was focusing attention entirely on the hypocrisy of MTG's position. "However," she continued, "I do think the American people deserve to understand the full scope of the financial relationships between NGOs and the politicians who regulate them." She opened the red folder and pulled out what appeared to be a bank statement. "This is a financial summary prepared by the Congressional Research Service at my request. It shows the total federal funding received by organizations that have made payments to current members of Congress over the past 5 years." The document was clearly official, typed on congressional letterhead with multiple authentication stamps. According to this analysis, conservative think tanks and advocacy organizations received $847 million in federal funding during this period. Liberal organizations received $931 million. The difference is significant, but not dramatic. roughly 9% more for liberal groups. She paused, letting the numbers register with both the committee and the viewing audience. However, when we look at the pattern of payments to individual members of Congress, a very different picture emerges. Another document came out of the folder, this one with a colorful chart that was clearly visible to the cameras. Conservative organizations made payments totaling $2.4 million to current House members over this same 5-year period. Liberal organizations made payments totaling $340,000. The mathematics were stark. Conservative groups were paying members of Congress at a rate 7 times higher than their liberal counterparts, despite receiving roughly equal amounts of federal funding. Now, I want to be clear, Jasmine continued, correlation is not causation. These numbers don't prove any wrongdoing by anyone. But they do suggest that if we're going to have a conversation about NGO influence on Congress, we need to look at the complete picture. MTG had been silent during this recitation of facts, but now she finally spoke up, her voice strained but defiant. Those numbers are taken completely out of context. Conservative organizations host legitimate educational events. They conduct real research. They're not just funneling money to politicians like these liberal activist groups. It was exactly the opening Jasmine had been waiting for. That's an interesting point, she said, reaching for yet another document. Because I have here the agenda for the Constitutional Liberty Foundation's annual conference from last year, the event where you received a $15,000 speaking fee. She held up what appeared to be a conference program. The theme was Restoring Constitutional Government. Your keynote speech was titled Defunding the Deep State, a Legislative Strategy. According to the program, you outlined specific bills you plan to introduce and asked attendees for their input on targeting particular federal agencies. The implications were becoming clearer with each revelation. This wasn't just about speaking fees. It was about using these events to coordinate legislative strategy with organizations that had direct financial interests in the outcomes. But perhaps most interesting, Jasmine continued, is this email exchange between conference organizers and major donors discussing how to maximize the impact of congressional attendance. She pulled out a sheet of paper with highlighted sections. Quote, having Representative Green address the donor dinner will help justify the increased contribution levels we're requesting. Her legislative agenda aligns perfectly with our funding priorities. End quote. The room was completely silent now. Even the Republican members had stopped their objections and were simply listening, perhaps beginning to understand the scope of what was being revealed. This email, Jasmine continued, was sent 2 weeks before the Constitutional Liberty Foundation received a $400,000 federal grant for their civic education initiative. The timeline was damning. The organization had explicitly used MTG's presence to solicit donations, then received federal funding shortly afterward, creating a circular flow of money that moved from federal grants to organizational coffers to political payments. But Jasmine saved the most devastating revelation for last. Mr. Chairman, I have one final document that I believe is essential for understanding the full scope of this issue. She reached into the red folder and pulled out what appeared to be a legal brief. This is a complaint filed with the Office of Congressional Ethics 3 weeks ago by the Campaign Legal Center, a nonpartisan watchdog organization. It alleges that multiple members of Congress have violated federal ethics rules by failing to properly disclose the full extent of their financial relationships with federally funded organizations. MTG's face went from pale to ashen. The mention of an active ethics complaint transformed this from a political embarrassment into a potentially criminal matter. According to this complaint, Jasmine continued, several members of Congress received payments that were structured to avoid disclosure requirements. Instead of direct speaking fees, they received book purchases for titles that were never published. Instead of consulting contracts, they received research grants for studies that were never completed. She looked directly at MTG for the first time since beginning this line of questioning. The complaint specifically mentions payments made to your office for a research project on constitutional limits of federal power, a project for which no final report was ever filed, despite payment of $25,000. The trap had been perfectly constructed and flawlessly executed. MTG had walked into the hearing prepared to attack liberal NGOs for corruption and influence peddling, only to find herself facing evidence that conservative organizations had been engaging in exactly the same behavior, but at a much larger scale and with better legal cover. The hearing room had become completely quiet, except for the sound of cameras clicking and reporters typing frantically on their phones. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would dominate political news for weeks to come. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of Jasmine's presentation wasn't any individual revelation. It was the systematic way she had dismantled MTG's entire argument using MTG's own standards and definitions. Every accusation MTG had made against liberal organizations could now be applied, with supporting documentation, to the conservative groups that had been paying her. The hearing that was supposed to be MTG's moment of triumph had become her political nightmare, and it had happened not through partisan attacks or inflammatory rhetoric, but through careful research and methodical presentation of facts. The chairman's attempts to regain control of the hearing were futile. What had begun as a routine oversight session had transformed into a moment of genuine political consequence, and everyone in the room understood that trying to shut it down now would only make the story bigger. MTG, meanwhile, had gone completely silent. Her earlier bravado had evaporated in the face of documented evidence that contradicted not just her accusations, but her entire political brand. The woman who had built her career on exposing corruption was now facing detailed allegations of exactly the kind of behavior she claimed to oppose. But Jasmine wasn't interested in delivering a knockout blow. Instead, she did something that would be remembered as perhaps the most effective political move of the entire session. She offered MTG a way out. "Mr. Chairman," she said, closing the red folder and setting it aside, "I want to return to the fundamental point that brought us here today. We all agree that federal funding of NGOs should be transparent and accountable. We all agree that the American people have the right to know how their tax dollars are being spent." Her tone had shifted from prosecutorial to conciliatory, but the change somehow made her earlier revelations more powerful rather than less. "What I've presented today isn't meant to embarrass anyone or score political points. It's meant to illustrate that the problems we're discussing are bipartisan problems. They affect organizations across the political spectrum, and they require bipartisan solutions." She stood and walked to the center of the room, positioning herself so that she was addressing both the committee and the cameras directly. "The real question isn't whether conservative or liberal NGOs are more corrupt. The real question is whether we're serious about creating a system that serves the American people rather than the political interests of Washington insiders." The pivot was masterful. By reframing the entire discussion around reform rather than blame, she was forcing everyone in the room to choose between partisan defensiveness and genuine accountability. "I propose that we work together on comprehensive NGO reform legislation, real transparency requirements that apply equally to all organizations, regardless of their political orientation. Genuine disclosure, rules that give the American people complete information about financial relationships between NGOs and elected officials." She pulled out a single sheet of paper from her original black folder. "I have here a draft bill that would require any organization receiving more than $100,000 in federal funding to disclose all payments made to current or former federal officials. It would require members of Congress to report not just the amount of such payments, but the specific services provided. and it would establish criminal penalties for attempts to circumvent these requirements through shell organizations or structured payments. The proposed legislation was brilliant politics. It addressed every issue that had been raised during the hearing while applying the same standards to everyone. MTG couldn't oppose it without appearing to support the very corruption she had spent her career attacking. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, this bill would establish an independent oversight board to monitor compliance, removing the responsibility from partisan officials who might have conflicts of interest. She looked directly at MTG again, but this time her expression was inviting rather than accusatory. I believe my colleague and I share the same fundamental goals: transparency, accountability, and government that serves the people rather than special interests. I hope she'll join me in supporting this legislation. The moment hung in the air like a challenge and an opportunity simultaneously. MTG could continue to defend the indefensible, making herself look increasingly hypocritical, or she could embrace reform and try to salvage her reputation by becoming part of the solution. But before MTG could respond, something unexpected happened. Republican committee member Tom Morrison of Indiana asked to be recognized. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to commend Congresswoman Crockett for her thorough research and her constructive approach to these issues. This is exactly the kind of bipartisan problem-solving that the American people want to see from Congress. It was a stunning break in partisan ranks. Morrison was a conservative Republican who rarely agreed with Democrats on anything, but the evidence Jasmine had presented was too comprehensive to dismiss along party lines. I would like to be listed as a co-sponsor of any legislation Congresswoman Crockett introduces on this topic, Morrison continued. These are accountability measures that every honest member of Congress should be able to support. The dominoes began falling immediately. Within minutes, 3 more Republican committee members had asked to be recognized to express support for reform legislation. The hearing that had begun as an attack on liberal NGOs had transformed into a bipartisan call for comprehensive ethics reform. MTG found herself in an impossible position. She could continue to oppose reform and appear corrupt, or she could support it and implicitly acknowledge that her earlier accusations had been hypocritical. Either choice would damage her politically, but only one offered a path toward eventual redemption. Mr. Chairman, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, I believe we all share the goal of transparency and accountability. If there are ways to improve our oversight of federal funding, regardless of which organizations receive it, then I'm willing to consider those improvements. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it wasn't opposition either. For someone who had built her brand on absolute positions and uncompromising rhetoric, even this partial concession represented a significant political retreat. Jasmine nodded acknowledgingly, but didn't gloat. Instead, she returned to her seat and made one final statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to working with all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to create a more transparent and accountable system for federal funding of nonprofit organizations. The American people deserve nothing less than complete honesty about how their tax dollars are spent and who benefits from those expenditures. The hearing concluded shortly afterward, but the real impact was just beginning. Within hours, video clips of Jasmine's methodical presentation were being shared across social media platforms. Unlike most congressional hearing moments that go viral because of shouting or dramatic confrontations, these clips were being shared because they showed something rare in modern politics, someone who had done their homework and presented facts in a calm, professional manner. Political analysts across the spectrum praised Jasmine's approach. Conservative commentator David Brooks wrote that Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated how effective opposition research can be when it's presented as a call for reform rather than a partisan attack. Liberal columnist Rachel Maddow noted that This is what accountability looks like when it's focused on systems rather than personalities. But perhaps the most significant response came from ordinary Americans who watched the hearing coverage on the evening news. Social media was filled with comments like, "Finally, a politician who came prepared," and "This is what we want from Congress, facts, not feelings." MTG's political brand, built on passionate attacks against corruption, had been severely damaged by revelations about her own financial relationships. But rather than trying to destroy her completely, Jasmine had offered her a path toward redemption through genuine reform. The NGO reform bill was introduced 3 weeks later with bipartisan support. It passed the House by a vote of 387 to 31 and was signed into law 6 months later, creating the most comprehensive transparency requirements for federally funded nonprofit organizations in American history. But the real victory wasn't legislative, it was cultural. Jasmine had demonstrated that effective opposition doesn't require shouting or personal attacks. Sometimes the most powerful political weapon is simply being better prepared than your opponents and presenting the truth in a way that makes denial impossible. The hearing became a case study in political communication, taught in schools across the country as an example of how research and preparation can be more powerful than rhetoric and outrage. And for Jasmine Crockett, it established her as a new kind of political figure, someone who could hold power accountable not through grandstanding, but through the simple revolutionary act of doing her homework and telling the truth. What the cameras didn't capture that day was the 6 months of meticulous investigation that preceded Jasmine Crockett's devastating presentation. The story began not in the halls of Congress, but in a cramped office in Austin, Texas, where a junior researcher named David Kim was processing routine Freedom of Information Act requests for a government watchdog organization. Kim had been tasked with reviewing financial disclosure forms for what should have been a straightforward transparency report. But as he cross-referenced speaking fees with federal grant awards, patterns began emerging that made him reach for his supervisor's phone number at 11:30 on a Friday night. "You need to see this," Kim had told Sarah Martinez, the organization's research director. "Either there's something seriously wrong with our database, or we've stumbled onto the biggest congressional ethics story in years." By Monday morning, Martinez was on a plane to Washington with a laptop full of preliminary findings and a growing suspicion that they had uncovered something that went far beyond simple disclosure violations. But she also knew that accusations without absolute proof would be dismissed as partisan attacks, regardless of how compelling the evidence appeared. That's when she made the decision that would ultimately change everything. She contacted Jasmine Crockett's office. The choice wasn't random. Martinez had followed Crockett's work on the Judiciary Committee and been impressed by her methodical approach to complex legal issues. Unlike many members of Congress who preferred soundbite-ready accusations, Crockett had a reputation for thorough preparation and fact-based arguments. The first meeting took place not in Crockett's congressional office, but in a quiet corner booth at a D.C. diner near Union Station. Martinez brought printouts of financial records. Crockett brought a legal pad and a dozen questions that demonstrated she understood both the political implications and the legal complexities of what they were discussing. "This isn't about party politics," Crockett had said after reviewing the initial documents. "If these patterns exist, they're undermining public trust in all of our institutions. But we need to be absolutely certain before we move forward." What followed was an investigation that would make seasoned journalists proud. Crockett's staff, working with Martinez's researchers, filed dozens of additional FOIA requests. They cross-referenced IRS filings with congressional financial disclosures. They analyzed bank records, conference agendas, and internal communications spanning 5 years of organizational activities. The breakthrough came when they discovered that several organizations had structured their payments to congressional members through subsidiary entities, creating a paper trail that was technically legal, but deliberately obscured the true sources of funding. A $25,000 research grant might flow through 3 different organizations before reaching a congressman's consulting firm, making it nearly impossible for ordinary citizens to track the money's origin. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was how widespread the practice had become. The investigation revealed that over 60 current House members had received payments from federally funded organizations, with the average amount exceeding $150,000 over the past 5 years. What had initially appeared to be a story about individual corruption turned out to be evidence of systemic dysfunction. The decision to focus on MTG wasn't personal, it was strategic. Her scheduled appearance at the NGO oversight hearing provided the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the hypocrisy of attacking liberal organizations while benefiting from conservative ones. But more importantly, her high profile meant that the story wouldn't be buried in the back pages of political trade publications. Crockett spent the weekend before the hearing in her office, not rehearsing dramatic speeches or preparing partisan attacks, but organizing documents and practicing the precise wording of her questions. She knew she would have one chance to present the information clearly and credibly, and that any appearance of grandstanding would undermine the seriousness of her findings. The night before the hearing, she made a decision that surprised even her own staff. She called MTG directly. "Marjorie, this is Jasmine Crockett. I wanted to give you a heads up about some information I'll be presenting tomorrow at the committee hearing." The conversation was brief and professional. Crockett didn't reveal the specific details of her evidence, but she made it clear that questions would be raised about financial relationships between NGOs and congressional members. "I'm not trying to blindside you," Crockett had said, "but I think the American people deserve answers about these issues." MTG's response was predictable, a mixture of defiance and dismissal. She clearly believed that her prepared remarks about liberal NGO corruption would overwhelm any questions about conservative organizations. It was a miscalculation that would prove politically fatal. The morning of the hearing, as MTG delivered her passionate opening statement, Crockett felt no satisfaction in what was about to unfold. This wasn't about destroying a political opponent. It was about forcing a long overdue conversation about money and influence in American politics. The immediate aftermath of the hearing exceeded everyone's expectations. The video clips didn't just go viral, they sparked a national conversation about congressional ethics that led to editorial demands for reform in newspapers across the political spectrum. Conservative publications like the Wall Street Journal editorial page called for comprehensive transparency measures, while liberal outlets like the Washington Post praised Crockett's methodical approach to accountability. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the culture of congressional oversight itself. Other members began emulating Crockett's approach, coming to hearings with carefully researched documentation rather than prepared talking points. The era of performative outrage began giving way to a new expectation of substantive preparation. Within 6 months, the NGO reform bill had become law, creating transparency requirements that extended far beyond the original scope of Crockett's investigation. Organizations receiving federal funding now had to disclose not just direct payments to officials, but any financial relationships with companies' foundations or entities connected to those officials. The story became required reading in political science courses across the country, not as an example of partisan warfare, but as a case study in how democratic accountability is supposed to work. When representatives know that citizens are watching, researching, and demanding answers, the entire system becomes more responsive to public interests rather than private influences. And in Austin, Texas, David Kim was promoted to senior researcher, with a new mandate to investigate financial relationships across all levels of government. The work continues because the price of democracy is eternal vigilance, and occasionally, someone willing to do the hard work of following the money wherever it leads. The documents Jasmine Crockett presented that day didn't disappear into congressional archives. They became the foundation for the most significant ethics reform in decades. But this story raises questions that every American should be asking. How many other financial relationships remain hidden? What other transparent organizations are operating in the shadows? And most importantly, what happens when we demand that our representatives actually represent us instead of their donors? This isn't just about one hearing or one politician. It's about whether we're willing to hold all of our elected officials to the same standards, regardless of party affiliation. The receipts are out there. The question is whether we'll demand to see them. Subscribe to stay informed about the stories that shape our democracy. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the moments when truth meets power. And let us know in the comments, what other political relationships do you think deserve this level of scrutiny? Because when politicians know we're watching and we're prepared, they can't hide behind talking points anymore. They have to face the facts.